I remember the first time I realized power wasn't just about money. It was about fear, respect, the kind of loyalty that doesn't bend for charm or kindness. It bends because it knows resistance is pointless. I started with nothing. Not a name, not a legacy, not a safety net. Just a vision and hands willing to bleed for it. Every deal, every contract, every empire-shaping decision was made in silence, alone, away from the world's eyes. I built skyscrapers that scraped the sky, bought companies that defined markets, and stitched a kingdom from the ruins of ambition. And I loved every second of it. I thought I controlled everything. I thought I controlled her. Her laugh had always been a delicate weapon, the kind that made people forget logic for a second. She was beauty and chaos wrapped in silk, and I was confident I had tamed it. We were married not just by vows, but by my belief in my dominion, the fantasy that love could be another asset to manage, another conquest. But reality, like glass, has a way of cutting you when you least expect it. It was a Thursday. The air smelled like rain and asphalt as I waited in the lobby of the building her family's conglomerate called home. I had a business to finalize that day, just another boardroom, just another handshake. And then I saw her. On stage, smiling for cameras, radiant, untouchable, and beside her him. He wore my suit, my bespoke creation, tailored for me, every stitch a signature of ownership. My name, embossed in gold on the inside lining, mocking me in silent accusation. For a heartbeat I froze. My chest ached with betrayal, but it wasn't just anger. Not yet. It was something heavier, a hollowing, a recognition that the illusion of control had always been exactly that, an illusion. Then a strange clarity cut through the haze of rage. I could destroy this. I would destroy this. I didn't scream. I didn't shake. I simply smiled quietly like a storm gathering behind a calm sky, and I began planning. The world would see her empire crumble before their eyes. Every secret, every weakness I had catalogued over the years, every subtle leverage I had carefully stored away, it was all coming to light. They wouldn't just lose, they would cease to exist in the narrative they had crafted for themselves. And me, I would remain, unstained, untouchable, the king of the ruins. That night, as the city lights shimmered on glass towers and puddles alike, I sat alone in my office, overlooking everything I had built. I sipped my whiskey slowly, tasting the bittersweet mix of victory and heartbreak. I realized then that power wasn't about conquering others. It was about mastering your own devastation and using it to forge reality into whatever shape you wanted. And I was ready. They called it a product launch. They called it a triumph. To me, it was a theater built on lies, and that stage had my name stitched into its seams. The hall smelled of polished wood and cheap cologne, the kind of manufactured warmth you get when a room is filled with people who want to be seen as important. Lights cut through the air like knives. Cameras blinked red. My pulse was a metronome set to slow violence. I could have stayed outside. I could have let strangers in tailored suits applaud a man wearing my jacket as if it were some clever costume. But the part of me that had spent a decade building empires from nothing wanted the truth to be visible, undeniable. I wanted the world to watch a carefully edited illusion collapse in real time. I walked in like any other guest, measured steps, hands in pockets, the faint smile of a man who knew he owned the room without having to announce it. Heads turned. A few eyebrows rose. My wife's smile faltered for a split second, recognition, then the practiced composure that had kept her safe in boardrooms and bedrooms alike. He was there, as if he belonged, breathing my air, wearing my name. The sight of that gold stitching was a physical blow. I could feel the heat behind my bones, the animal certainty that things were about to change. I crossed the stage in 3 strides. The applause washed over us, pitiless, perfect, and I stepped into it like a blade into silk. Cameras swiveled. Flashbulbs popped. For a moment, the world held its breath waiting to see if I would roar. I did something quieter. I reached out and grabbed the lapel of his jacket, my fingers curling around the fabric just beneath my name. The fabric was absurdly soft, tailored to a body I had left a mark on, but that softness couldn't hide the lie. I pulled hard, and the jacket came away in my hands. The seam tore like cheap paper, and with it, everything they'd rehearsed for months. Gasps spiraled. A camera zoomed in and caught the gold letters, my name twisting in the light like a witness. He stumbled, startled, exposed. He tried to laugh it off, but the laugh was thin and brittle. The room smelled the betrayal now, and the air tasted like copper. I didn't say a word. Words are for negotiations. The ripping of cloth was louder than any speech I could give. My wife's face went from composed executive to a mask that had come free at the edges, hollow, frightened, and suddenly very human. When I stepped down from the stage, the cameras followed every inch of me. People whispered. Reporters smelled a story, and the scent of scandal spread faster than any press release. Backstage, the hushed chaos felt unreal. Assistants milled about with trembling hands, phones lighting up like fireflies. She found me then, eyes sharp with something that hadn't been there before. Shame, perhaps, or the recognition that she had miscalculated how deep my appetite for resolution went. "You should leave," she said, voice brittle. "This is a show," I finished for her. "Yes." She tried to place her hand on my arm like we were still partners in some old play. I let her touch me for a second and felt the lie behind the warmth. Then I turned away. The phone call I made that night was not one that could be described with bravado. It was a series of soft, precise movements, numbers dialed, names mentioned, a few rehearsed sentences that left no room for argument. I spoke to an old friend on the exchange who owed me more than he knew. I left a voicemail for a bank president whose gratitude had been optional in the past. I called legal counsel, and in a voice that was all business, I authorized an audit that would be impossible for them to ignore. I did not need to shout. It is astonishing how quiet power can be, how a single sentence delivered in the right tone can begin to unspool an empire. By dawn, certain stock positions wobbling in the periphery had been nudged. Letters carefully worded, anonymously sent, began to appear in inboxes. Board members who had once smiled at my wife's family suddenly remembered other engagements. Suppliers found themselves suddenly reassessed. Little things, each one a pinprick. Together they bled the illusion until it showed the seams. Revenge in practice is surgical. It isn't the cinematic explosion some would prefer. It's a series of rational, miserable adjustments, withdrawals, defaults, disclosures. It's the quiet folding of paper and the louder crumpling of reputations. It is moving with the certainty of someone who knows where all the skeletons hide and quietly beginning to pull them out one by one. They tried to push back. Press conferences were rescheduled. Damage control statements were drafted and redrafted until the paper smelled of desperation. A hostile op-ed appeared in a morning paper. A handful of reliable sources whispered about personal troubles and corporate restructuring. But when the money begins to whisper, even the boldest lies become inconvenient. Allies begin to distance themselves. Promises expire. And through it all, there was me, ghostly patient, present in moments they didn't know to fear. I watched as people who had once flattered my wife's family now phoned me with thin, deferential tones. They offered to help. They offered loyalty. Some even apologized. Their faces said what their words could not. "We did not understand you. We had assumed you would be merciful." Mercy had never been the business I was in. That night the city hummed with the sort of tension that precedes a storm. In my apartment the lights were dim. The suit, the ruined piece of fabric that had become a symbol, lay on the table like a relic. I picked at a loose thread, tracing the gold letters with a fingertip. My hands didn't shake. The wound inside me had turned into something else, an exacting instrument. Before sleep claimed me, I let my mind run through the ledger of retribution. There were portfolios to reconfigure, legal levers to pull, reputations to dismantle with the slow, meticulous cruelty of truth. I would not annihilate them in a single, dramatic gesture. I would erase them in the sober way that empires are erased, through attrition, exposure, and the patient turning of people's attention. And yet beneath the planning and the cold machinery, a quieter thing stirred. Grief is sneaky. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, patient and steady, till the victory tastes less like triumph and more like ash. I felt that ache as I lay in the dark, for what I had thought I owned, for the illusion of control that marriage had promised, for the tender smallness of the life I had imagined and now watched disintegrate. The next day the headlines were cautious, quick to call it a scandal, slower to name the dead centers of influence. Comment sections filled with moralizing strangers. My wife's family issued statements that read like confessions without admissions. Investors fretted. The markets shivered. I read it all with a cold, precise attention, noting which sentences hit hardest and which people were ready to believe them. They came at me with lawyers and denials, with late-night calls and thinly veiled threats. They thought they could bribe, bully, or bargain their way out. But I had spent too many years learning how to wait. The first move had been public. The rest would be quiet, meticulous, and final. In the center of the storm, I tasted something I hadn't expected. Not joy, not relief, but a hollow satisfaction, like clearing a room that had once been filled with ghosts. I had torn the mask from their faces, and the world had seen the truth. That was power. Still, as the city moved on and new scandals flickered briefly in the papers, the hollow in me remained. Victory, I was discovering, is not a cure. It is a punctuation. It ends a sentence, but it doesn't always turn the page. I had begun the war. The battlefield would be long and complicated, but I was, as always, prepared to do the work with my own two hands. And when they finally came crawling, believing that time heals all things, they would learn another lesson. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. They taught me numbers in boardrooms, but what I learned later, what mattered more, was the geometry of people. How loyalties bend, where pressure cracks, which shame lines will split a family like brittle porcelain. Revenge is arithmetic only in the hands of those who understand the variables: time, influence, greed, and the brittle human instinct to avoid looking foolish. The days that followed were surgical. I moved along invisible seams of their world, credit lines clipped, partners quietly encouraged to reevaluate exposure, a shadow auditor placed behind polite smiles. Each action was an equation, small enough to be plausible, large enough to cause panic. I was precise because imprecision begets mercy, and mercy is a luxury for fools. They hired crisis managers who smelled of disinfectant and certainty. They staged interviews in sunlit offices with statements that used words like unfortunate and isolated incident. Their PR spun and spun until the rope frayed. Board members shuffled positions like pieces on a chessboard, trying to hide the checkmate that had already been laid. I watched them from my office, high enough to see the city like a map, letting the slow, patient dismantling feel like a performance I had choreographed. There were small victories that tasted like iron. A long-standing supplier, nervous about exposure, pulled their support on a product line that was central to the family's public image. A quiet investor canceled a planned infusion after an internal review. One of their banks froze a tranche of funds while legal assessed potential liabilities. None of these were dramatic in isolation, but together they created the kind of pressure that makes people do unwise things. And people did unwise things. My wife's father, once a man who laughed too loudly at his own stories, began appearing frail in public photos. He called me once, voice thin and rehearsed, offering platitudes that felt like a white flag. I listened while he tried to find a place to land the conversation that wouldn't betray the panic in the room. He asked for a meeting to discuss terms. I told him we should meet soon. I set the time, knowing that the wait would keep him awake longer than any conversation. Her brother, always quick with charity and compliments, stumbled into something like confession at a private dinner, looking years older in the span of a week. He reached for my hand as if we were old friends and said, "We can make this right." His eyes were hungry for absolution. His mouth spoke calculations. I let him talk and collected every word like currency. Every interaction wore the sheen of negotiation, but hummed with humiliation. They were learning that influence is not just a currency you spend. It is also a record that can be called in. And I had kept ledgers of leverage like fossils in a museum, each one labeled and catalogued. But among the cold moves and calculated conversations, there were moments that landed like stones in still water, ripples that reached parts of me I hadn't built this armor to protect. Once in the quiet of a late afternoon, my wife and I were summoned to a mediated meeting at a boutique law firm. They had moved us into the smallest room, as if to convince themselves intimacy could still be manufactured. She arrived in something simple, no stage makeup, hair tucked behind her ears, an ordinary woman beneath the photogenic armor. Up close, I could see the tiredness at the corners of her eyes, the way she blinked too fast sometimes, as if she was trying to stop memory from leaking out. She spoke, measured and conciliatory, words honed in glossy interviews. But when she looked at me, something unpracticed flickered there. A memory of the first winter we had shared an apartment too small for our ambitions, a coffee stain on a cheap table, the smallness of that life that had once been enough. For a second I saw not the architect of a family's fortunes, but the person who had once laughed at terrible movies with me and fallen asleep mid-plot, head heavy against my shoulder. The sight was a blade with a weighted handle, sharp but familiar. "Do you remember the park?" she asked, voice low, as if speaking to a stranger would preserve her dignity. "The ice cream truck that never showed up." It was a ridiculous memory to anchor a mediation, but I answered, "Yes." The word felt like admitting to something private in a room full of witnesses. She blinked, and for a moment her rehearsed composure slipped. "You were so gentle then," she said, half to herself. "You promised we wouldn't trade what mattered." I could have used that, the confession, the nostalgia, as leverage. I could have reduced it to a soundbite. "See, he had a heart once." Instead, I felt the old, unexpected tenderness that had once made me believe in an impossible unity. It was quick, faint, a fissure in the wall I had built. Then the room filled again with lawyers, verbosity, and the tenderness closed like a book. Moments like that were dangerous because they reminded me that people are not only actors with parts to play. They are also archives of small human failures and unexpected kindnesses. They threatened to complicate the equation. But I pressed on. The media turned our unraveling into ritual. Columnists parsed every movement for scandal, moralists weighed in with sanctimony, and social feeds converted private sorrow into caricature. I cultivated a silence in the storm. I let them shout and watched how the echoes revealed who actually listened. Those who rushed to the microphones revealed panic. Those who whispered at my door revealed calculation. I answered select calls with the calm of a man who had rehearsed indifference until it felt like truth. There were nights when I woke, sweating, replaying the press conference like a looped film. The moment my hand tore the jacket, the small physicality of ownership reclaimed, played on repeat. Sometimes I hated that the image had become indelible. Sometimes I cherished the clarity it brought. Truth in a public space is a weapon, and I had wielded it. As their world contracted, their pleas became naked and pitiful. They offered things, shares, seats, contrition, that would have been delectable had they not come soured with the taste of deceit. I watched them arrange humiliations like sacrificial offerings, convinced that a public show of penance could buy back what had been taken. They did not understand that some breaches are not currency exchangeable. Some betrayals are structural, not transactional. At the edge of my fury, where the machinist in me met the human, there was another struggle, the cost of the dismantling. Each corporation that faltered meant livelihoods that would ripple outward. Employees, real people, would suffer. I had not wanted collateral, I wanted the guilty to suffer. Yet vengeance has a way of radiating beyond the intended target. I began to make adjustments to my strategy, not out of mercy exactly, but from a recognition that annihilation can be indistinguishable from cruelty. I rerouted certain actions to minimize harm to the powerless while still ensuring the powerful felt the collapse. I leaked specifics in ways that rattled executives and shareholders, but left rank-and-file employees with the dignity of their paychecks. It was a surgical cruelty, designed to punish the culpable and spare the innocent where possible. Perhaps that made me complicit in my own myth, ruthless but principled. One night, alone in a kitchen that had once been the scene of small arguments and larger reconciliations, I found myself turning a coffee mug in my hands and thinking about mercy in a way I never had before. The thought surprised me. Mercy felt like a luxury or a confession, neither of which suited the man I had become. They called for a public apology, her family, their lawyers, their PR machine, an ostentatious performance of regret. They believed spectacle could heal the breach. I agreed to meet them once more, not to watch their theatrics, but to issue a statement of my own. I would not grovel. I would not theatrically forgive. I intended to be absolute, a single sentence that would close the door without slamming it. When the cameras were on and the lights cut the crowd in white, I spoke plainly. I did not recite indignation or give the world something to cheer or condemn. Instead, I spoke of boundaries and the sanctity of trust, of how some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. I said it simply, because simple things land harder in crowds trained to expect drama. The cameras liked my restraint. The newspapers liked the contrast between my coldness and their heat. For a moment, the world thought I had the final word. But I knew better. This was an experiment in attrition, and I had many variables left to manipulate. As I walked away from the press podium, past the cluster of flashes and murmurs, I felt both lighter and more burdened than before. Each victory added weight, like a cresting wave of iron. The man I had been, hungry and singular in purpose, seemed distant. The man I was becoming, precise, slower, capable of selective mercy, was not entirely to my dislike. Perhaps that was the strangest casualty of all. The person I had thought I needed to be to win was different from the person I wanted to be when the dust settled. The war continued, slow and exacting. But in the quiet spaces, on sudden rain-soaked rooftops, in the hollow of a late-night theater where I once watched a silly film with her, there were remnants of tenderness that survived the siege. They were small, stubborn things. The smell of her hair after a rain, the memory of a shared joke, the soft cadence of a nickname whispered in darkness. They did not stop the dismantling. They simply made each victory a little less gleeful and each loss a little more personal. When the chapter closed that week, I did not celebrate. I catalogued. I recalculated. I prepared for the longer stretches of the campaign, the legal fights, the allies who might yet turn, the private witnesses who carried secrets like poisoned gifts. The map of their ruin was still being drawn, and I was patient. I had learned to be. Somewhere between the arithmetic and the small mercies, I started to understand the price of being king. It is not the crown or the view. It is the quietness that follows the storm, the knowledge that in winning you have carved paths through living things. That knowledge is a companion. It doesn't make victory less sweet, but it makes the quiet afterwards more complicated, less of triumph, more of reckoning. The next moves would require more than leverage. They would demand choices, moral and tactical, that would define not only the outcome of their empire, but the shape of the man left standing when the lights went out. By the time the next month rolled around, their world had become a delicate lattice of panic, suspicion, and fragile alliances. I had planted seeds everywhere, small, imperceptible, yet inevitable in their consequences. Every move they made to stabilize themselves played right into the architecture of their undoing. It was not chaos I wanted. It was inevitability. The difference is subtle but crucial. I watched her from a distance more often than I cared to admit. Not with desire, not with longing, though perhaps a part of me still remembered that, but with curiosity. She was performing now in a way I had never seen before, always composed, always smiling, but under the surface the tension pulled at her edges. Her empire was cracking, and she knew it. Every carefully curated image of control now betrayed her pulse. It was during a dinner with a mutual acquaintance, an investor who owed me more than gratitude, that I first truly saw her desperation. The restaurant was dim, with amber lights throwing long shadows across lacquered tables. She laughed, fluid, effortless, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a subtle twitch, a tightness in her jaw, a glance at the door every few seconds. Her companion, oblivious to the undercurrent, kept talking about quarterly profits and brand expansion. I let them speak. I let her perform. I understood that desperation is often more honest than confession. It cannot be hidden completely. The first strike that evening was symbolic but effective. I instructed the acquaintance to accidentally misplace a crucial contract, a document that would confirm a pending acquisition for her company. A small oversight, invisible to most, devastating to the prepared. Within hours, panic spread through her executive team. Emails flew. Calls were made. Security checks intensified. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the tension of people unaccustomed to error. And she held herself together, but I could see the cracks. The mask was there, yes, but it did not fully conceal the fear. There was a subtle twitch of her fingers, a hesitation in her laughter, a fraction of a second where she looked at the ceiling as if searching for guidance. I reminded myself then that power is not only measured by control, it is measured by observation, by patience, by knowing what to do and knowing when to act. I had the blueprint of their weakness, every nerve ending of their empire mapped. By nightfall, I had initiated another sequence of quiet devastation. Stock values were nudged, partnerships subtly undermined, and whispers of fiscal mismanagement seeded among shareholders. One of her allies called me, voice trembling, offering assistance that could no longer be effective. I listened, made neutral noises, and hung up. I did not need to speak. My silence was a hammer. Later, alone in my office, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. The empty whiskey glass before me reflected a fragmented version of the city lights outside. I realized something dangerous. The satisfaction of victory is fleeting. Each action, each calculated move is ephemeral, vanishing almost as quickly as it is executed. The only permanence is the imprint left on those who feel it. And she would feel it. The next morning brought the first cracks of public acknowledgement. Press releases hinted at internal restructuring. Whispered rumors spread across social media, and her carefully maintained image began to fray. Executives who had been loyal to her family began to reconsider allegiances. She moved quickly, trying to patch the holes, but every patch was a reminder that the structure beneath had been compromised. She reached out to me that evening, a single understated message: "We need to talk privately." I read it and let it sit. There was no urgency in my response. Urgency is a weapon only the desperate wield. I wrote back simply, "We always talk when the moment is right. I'll see you tomorrow." And tomorrow came. It was not in a public space. It was not under lights or cameras. It was in a small, neutral room chosen to minimize witnesses and maximize attention. She entered, careful, measured, professional, but I could see the tension curled around her like smoke. She had chosen a skirt that fell just below her knees, heels that clicked softly against the polished floor, hair swept into a practical knot. The only adornment was the faintest trace of perfume, the same one I remembered from years ago, but now almost too subtle to notice. She began with business. She spoke in careful sentences, softening edges, offering reparations, suggesting solutions. I listened, eyes narrowed, taking in every gesture, every inflection, every micro-expression that betrayed her intent. Then she paused. She looked at me directly, eyes bright, almost pleading. "I didn't think you would go this far." Her words were honest in a way her smile never had been. She thought she knew me. She thought she controlled the boundaries. She had never understood one simple truth: some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. I didn't answer immediately. Silence is a kind of eloquence, especially in the face of expectation. The room pressed in with it like gravity made visible, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, steady, certain. "You will not control me. You will not control this, and you will not pretend that your world is intact when I am finished." She flinched, not at volume, not at aggression, but at the precision of the statement. It was a line drawn in reality, and she was standing on the wrong side. As she left, I let her go with the smallest gesture of finality, a nod, quiet, unsentimental, like a judge leaving the bench. No words of forgiveness, no false promises, only observation, patience, and the knowledge that the next chapter would be the one where she understood that her world was no longer hers to command. I returned to the city view, lights reflecting on the river below, and let the silence settle. This was only the threshold. The true undoing, the part that would be remembered, was still to come. The world has a way of revealing truth slowly, but destruction, true, total destruction, is instantaneous in its emotional resonance. I had been patient, methodical, surgical in my dismantling, but the crescendo was approaching. By now, her company's foundation had begun to tremble visibly. Quarterly reports missed projections, partnerships wavered, and whispers of mismanagement snowballed into headlines. Executives who had once followed her without question now cast sideward glances at my moves, the invisible hand guiding chaos. They began to panic quietly, a subtle quiver in the corporate skeleton that had seemed unshakable. It was during another public engagement, a conference meant to showcase innovation, that I made my presence fully known. I did not enter like a vengeful storm, but like a ghost passing through a familiar house. The room hummed with polite applause, and she smiled, teeth bright and practiced. Yet something in the angle of her shoulders betrayed her awareness. She knew the game was no longer hers. I watched as he, the man who had worn my jacket as if it granted him passage into my world, faltered under the gaze of everyone present. Cameras caught subtle moments, the tightening of his jaw, the twitch of his fingers. I let them fester. I let them see the unease that had begun to ripple outward from me, touching all their careful facades. Then, with quiet precision, I began the final moves. Financial audits I had quietly commissioned converged on her family's most prized assets, revealing mismanagement and hidden liabilities that even their most loyal accountants had overlooked. Regulators called. Investors demanded explanations. Partners reconsidered contracts. I had turned the machinery of law, money, and media into a single instrument, and it sang. She approached me after the session, face flushed with controlled fury. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice pitched between anger and disbelief. "You're destroying everything." I allowed a shadow of a smile. "Fairness is irrelevant," I replied. "I am merely restoring balance to a system you broke long ago." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw something raw pain, yes, but also the ember of respect. The knowledge that the man she had underestimated had become unstoppable. By nightfall, the family's empire was unraveling faster than they could manage. Their flagship company's stock was down 20%. Public perception, manipulated subtly but relentlessly, had begun to turn against them. Suppliers withdrew. Partners hesitated. Even loyal executives started seeking safer ground. And still I felt no jubilation, only quiet clarity. Victory, I realized, is never about joy. It is about resolution, the cold, undeniable assertion of consequence. I had unleashed what they thought they could contain, and now the consequences rippled outward like shockwaves. Later, I sat alone in my penthouse. The city sprawled beneath me in a grid of light and shadow. The phone on the table buzzed incessantly, updates from brokers and legal contacts, confirmations of successes that were complete yet cruelly incremental. I traced my finger along the rim of a glass of whiskey, tasting the bitterness of accomplishment. The suit that had sparked the initial fury still hung in my closet, a silent relic of the first strike. It was then I realized something. In victory, in watching the ruin of those who had betrayed trust, there is no triumph like one imagines in novels or films. The quiet moments, the reflections, the echoes of what has been broken, linger far longer than applause ever could. I thought of her again, the woman who had been my wife, the architect of deception and charm. Somewhere, under the pretense of power and poise, I sensed her fear and awe. I did not need to confront her directly anymore. The work spoke. The destruction, meticulous and complete, was its own language. And yet, in the back of my mind, an ember flickered, a subtle acknowledgement of the human cost, of tenderness lost, of intimacy irretrievably severed. It was a reminder that absolute victory has a weight no ledger can quantify. The empire I had built with my own hands remained intact. My influence was unshaken, and the ruins below were a testament to the fact that betrayal, once exposed, cannot be undone. They would never come back, they would never rebuild, and I, standing above it all, knew that some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed. The city is quieter when you're the one who has moved the pieces. Not silent, there's always the soft hum of traffic, the occasional siren, but quieter in the way a theater settles after the audience leaves and the stagehands have swept the confetti into a single, inevitable pile. The lights stay on because buildings need power. People go on with their small, urgent lives. But the noise that once defined my world, the white noise of obligation, of expectation, of people performing for the illusion of permanence, had thinned. They were gone in the way bad weather recedes, a process that leaves a distinct smell, a tension in the air, a landscape altered even when everything looks the same. Headlines that had screamed my handiwork dissolved into the daily churn. Comment sections that had been a fever broke and cooled. Her family, once a constellation of influence and wealth, was reduced to a set of filings, a handful of liquidations, and a dozen names that no longer mattered at cocktail parties. I kept the ledger of their ruin like one keeps a photograph of a former self, careful, private, and oddly tender. It was not spite that made me catalog every callback and consequence. It was the professional instinct that had built empires in the first place. I liked to know the shape of things I'd taken apart. There was a strange comfort in order. In the quiet after, the first thing I did was walk the block where our first apartment had been. The building had a new paint job and a new concierge who smiled in ways people do when they've been trained to. The coffee shop downstairs played a playlist that was not the one I remembered. There was no monument to the smallness of us, no plaque, no story, just a city that had kept going. I sat at a corner table and drank cheap coffee and let myself listen for a younger laugh that would not come. People assumed victory makes you immune to regret. They are wrong. What it does is change the character of your regrets. Before, they were petty, missed meetings, bad deals, moments of ego. After, they are larger, salted with a new awareness, the knowledge that in shaping the world you also break the things inside it you had once loved. I allowed myself a day of stillness. I moved through rooms in my penthouse with the slow curiosity of someone cataloging a museum he had curated. Each object was where I had placed it. Each photograph was a chapter. Her picture, the one taken before everything went wrong, sat in an ash-gray frame on a shelf. She was laughing in it. Hair caught by a wind that looked like freedom. For a long time I stared at that laugh and could not decide if it was evidence of joy or evidence of how well we'd pretended. Someone else might have burned the photograph, made a ritual out of destruction. I did not. I put it back and closed the drawer. There are some ruins you don't have to finish. There were consequences I had not fully accounted for. The people who had been collateral, managers, secretaries, drivers, came to me, sometimes months later, with small, pragmatic needs. I provided anonymously where I could. It was not altruism so much as a tidy conscience. If my architecture of revenge had displaced them, then I should at least ensure they had a landing to break their fall. Doing so offered a strange, private warmth, the kind a man feels when he fixes a lamp for someone who cannot afford a new one. It was small, and it made me feel less like a machine. The world, mercifully, has a short memory for spectacle. Within a year, other scandals filled the feeds and other empires vied for headlines. My victories became a footnote in someone else's essay about power. I did not mind. Fame is weight. I had less use for it than I once pretended. Sometimes I found myself imagining a life where the suit had never been torn, where betrayal had been a quiet, private fissure, and not a public cathedral of shame. In those imaginings, we were not architects of empires but two people who ate terrible takeout and watched late-night movies until we fell asleep on the couch. The imagination was a traitor and a comfort. It reminded me that there had been tenderness here, stubborn and small, and therefore irreplaceable. She reached out once, not with pleas, not with public statements, but with a letter that arrived folded and precise, like her public persona but softer at the edges. It said things that were not apologies and not accusations, merely observations, that she had misread my contours, that she was learning the difference between control and possession, that some things, once done, cannot be undone. She ended with a sentence I did not expect. I hope you find peace, in the same way I will learn to find mine. I held that paper until the ink blurred from the heat of my hands. I did not answer. My silence was not cruelty, it was finality. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the last necessary move of a long game. It rings like the space after an orchestra ends a symphony, not nothing, but a fullness of absence. I learned to walk inside it. Sometimes I filled the hours with work. There is always another building to buy, another company to save or to purge. Sometimes I filled it with music, the slow, reverberant kind that seems to press time flat and reveal the contours of thought. Sometimes, alone at 2 in the morning, I would open the closet where that suit still hung and run my fingers over the gold stitching as if it were braille. Victory had given me dominion, yes. It had also given me solitude. I am not naive enough to confuse the two. Power does not bring companionship. It brings distance. People come for favors, for leverage, for the light you can reflect on them. Very few come because they love the shadows you create. And yet the world felt right in the way that only truth can feel right. Honest, unadorned, folded into its natural form. I had broken what deserved breaking and left what remained intact. There is a peculiar art to ending things without spectacle, an economy that values consequence over dramatics. That economy defined me now. On the 10th anniversary of the press conference, I stood on the roof of a building I did not own, the old headquarters of a rival I had bought and repurposed, and watched the sunrise make the glass of the city burn. The light looked no different than the morning light I had watched from other rooftops many times before. It was simply morning. People below were unpacking carts and setting up shops. Someone laughed loudly at a joke no one else heard. In the end, perhaps that is the truest reward. The ability to wake, to move, to be present in the small things that constitute a life beyond headlines. I am untouched in the ways that matter to a ledger, unrivaled in the measures of influence I once worshipped. But I am also carved by the work I have done, marked by the choices that erased faces and names from the map I once loved. I do not know if I would do it all again. The man who built an empire with his own 2 hands is not the same man who holds its keys. Maybe that is as it should be. There is comfort in continuity, but there is also the strange, hollowing grace of sacrifice. As the sun rose, I let the warmth sit on my skin and thought of lines, drawn, crossed, erased. Some are boundaries, some are scars. Both hold memory. Both teach you what you are willing to protect and what you are willing to lose. I folded my hands and watched the city wake. The throne I had claimed was no longer a place. It was a state of being, unbowed, deliberate, and solitary. It suited me well enough. But under the suit and the ledger and the glass, I kept a small, guarded room of tenderness, a relic of the life I had loved and destroyed, and the quiet, private ache that remained as proof I had ever been human.